Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our almost weekly series of community conversations that Sierra Club hosts. And tonight we've got a great discussion lined up. We have Representative Rebecca White, who is on the House Transportation Committee, and Senator Andy Perchlik, who's on the Senate Transportation Committee, to join us to talk about what's up in the State House or wherever that all happens now in the area of transportation. And it turns out that it's a pretty interesting mix this year, maybe some new ways of doing things. So without further ado, I'm just going to pass it right along to Representative Becca White. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Sierra Club. This is great. Thanks for the introduction, Steve, again. Yep, my name is Becca, and I represent the Windsor 4-2 district, which is the White River Junction, Hartford region, alongside my co-representative for the district, Representative Coach Christie. So it's great to be here. A little bit about me. As mentioned, I serve on the Transportation Committee. In my paid job, I work for Efficiency Vermont. And for this fun extracurricular activity, it's my second term. So I'm really kind of a newbie, but it feels a little less new this time around. Yeah, and speaking of virtual versus in person, it's our first, I think we had our first official week wrapping up, and now we're getting into week 2 of our virtual State House. So this is where I live for just about 10 to 12 hours a day. You can't see it, but I have a treadmill beside me because, I need to get a little exercise. So it's great to be here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some work that the Transportation Committee on the House side has been doing in preempt of the start of the session, but also that we're going to be continuing for the biennium. And that's the introduction of something called the Transportation Modernization Act of 2021. So big, bold name. We're trying to have it be there's no real acronym, but TMA has been floating around. So if you really want an acronym, there you go. And the Transportation Modernization Act was essentially the brainchild of Representative Kurt McCormick, who was the chair the previous biennium, who has chosen not to be the chair this term. And Kurt has been dedicated to rethinking transportation and the systems that we have in place right now, and how can we make them more accessible, more affordable, and how can we reduce carbon, all kind of in the same go. He's a guy who doesn't own a car, so he practices what he preaches. And some key features of the bill that we are working on and currently seeking co-sponsorship for. We actually worked closely with Rob to get a press release out before the session started. So a lot of the pieces, if you did see that press release, same things that we're trying to get done in the bill now. We want to add electric vehicle incentives, continue to build on what we did in previous years. We want to have level 2 chargers be more accessible, increasing those in downtown, schools, parks, park and rides, my apologies. Really making sure that they're in a place that someone who's traveling, even though we know the majority of our charging for our electric vehicles happens at home, there are still times people, you want to stop over. And if you're like me and you're going to downtown Brattleboro, you want to have a place that you can charge for a period of time. Another key feature of the bill is transit buses and school buses having a requirement for those newly purchased vehicles being all electric. We want to have a transportation demand management plan for large employers. Transportation demand management is essentially a toolkit of policies that mandates or requires that a business or an organization rethinks how people are getting from point A to point B and lowers the amount of single person, single vehicle trips. The idea transportation demand management can include carpooling. It can include what we're all doing right now with telecommuting. Like, we have nailed telecommuting. If there's one teeny silver lining to this whole situation, some of us are getting that. A couple of other pieces just to run through before I pass it on to Senator Perchlik. Transportation isn't just vehicles. I think that's a fundamental paradigm shift we have to make. It's about travel and how can you get somewhere, and that doesn't necessarily mean a vehicle or a car is the best way to do that. That means increasing bicycle corridors, having a real adoption of complete streets, which is a policy that supports bike and pedestrian travel when we build projects. That kind of change is important. And then there's some other pieces around, EV bike incentives and requiring some parking space based, per percentage of a parking space having an electric vehicle charger in that location as well. So that's really it in a nutshell. I went kind of fast because I wanted to make sure we had time to answer questions. Just to wrap up that bill, the goal here is first and foremost making transportation more accessible and more affordable. Our system does not work for Vermonters right now. Oh, I forgot one of the big ones: fare-free public transit. That's like a key feature, and that hits right at home to what I was just saying around affordability. So while carbon reduction is important, we're really staking the claim of the value of this bill kind of in that whole picture of affordability, accessibility, equity, and clean energy. That's really a modern way to look at it. But yeah, I'll pass it over to Senator Perchlik.
Great, thanks, Becca. Deb Sachs is asking in the chat if we have a list of the things for the bill, but yeah, we can get that to you. Yeah, it's great to have Becca in the House Transportation Committee, and really having your energy on this new Transportation Modernization Act is great. And like Becca said, I want to have time for questions, but I was going to say there's kind of 5 things that we're working on in Senate Transportation. One, of course, is COVID related things, but specifically there's a bunch of federal CARES Act 2 money for transportation. And even though some of it will need to be used for highways and have some federal restrictions, it'll free up state money. And so I hope that's kind of what we can use to fund some of the things that we'll have in the Transportation Modernization Act that's going to come out of the House. But the other big thing that I'm hoping that we work on is electrification of our transportation sector. That's electric cars, but it's also electric buses. And there are other alternative ways of moving the vehicles around, but I'm focused on electrification. Happy to talk about other things if people want to talk about hydrogen or biofuels or other things. But in particular, there's an effort that I'm going to be working on to make sure that electric car manufacturers are able to open a service center in Vermont. Right now, the law forbids them to do so. And so the world's largest electric car manufacturer wants to build a service center in Vermont, but is currently not allowed to do so under state law. So I'd like to work on that change. Would like to work on trains and passenger rail. The Amtrak train is still shut down. You can't ride it now for COVID reasons, which I understand and support, but I want to make sure that as soon as we can, that we get the Amtrak running again and continue to work on our effort to expand passenger rail in Vermont. And particularly, I'm excited about when we can get the train up to Montreal again. There was a time where you could ride the train to Montreal, and haven't been able to do that for a while. So I'm looking forward to working on that. And like Becca said, it's not all about cars. One thing that I learned, like Becca, I'm only been on in this legislature for 1 term. We came in at the same freshman class. And it's one thing I learned on transportation last time is there's quite a bit that transportation does, the Transportation Committee in AOT does, that's not about cars. Do a lot of bike paths, do a lot of other modes, pedestrian crosswalks, other ways to allow people to ride their bikes or walk to where they need to go. And things like the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail, I think, is going to be great for Vermont and a great example of what we can do to and get people out of cars and use it as a transportation corridor, not just a recreational corridor. And then also the thing I want to focus on is on equity issues, particularly around low income and how low income folks need to get around in rural areas, and working with Capstone on a program that we funded 2 years ago now, but is going to be running out of funds, and want to see how we can expand that to get folks into vehicles, into the highest mileage vehicles we can, or electric vehicles, because a lot of them are spending a lot of their money on gas. So if we can get them into a hybrid or even an electric car, that's great for our environmental issues as well as our equity issues. And there are some other programs around public transportation that I think will also help low income. And I think the microtransit that's happening in Montpelier, people want to talk about that. Happy to talk about how that's been going. But I think I'm really looking forward to that being successful so we can expand it throughout the state. But with that, I'll leave it open to questions. Who's going to be fielding the questions? Rob?
Well, I'll do some fielding and pass it right on to you guys.
Okay.
But I wanted to say to everybody, if you have questions, just make a mention of it, at least, write the word stack in the chat, or because there are so many, I'm not sure I will see everybody's hand waving. So just put something, feel free to write your whole question into the chat, but mostly I would just call on you to ask your own question. But I have a quick question, and that relates to the electric vehicles and servicing the vehicles. Is that concept where you don't have a dealership but you want to do service? Is that the drawback or the hurdle that people are facing?
Well, there is a hurdle for Tesla owners that Tesla will come to your house, which is like one of the good things about owning one of those vehicles, is that they will come to your house to fix small things. But if it needs to be up on a lift, you need to go to Boston, Montreal if the border was open, or down to Albany area. So it's one reason I've heard from that people don't want to buy one is because there's no service center in the state. And Tesla wants to open one. I think when other electric car manufacturers start selling cars, Rivian and others, we want to encourage that investment in the state. And it's right now we're losing that business to the out of state when they service those cars. So that's the issue. If that answers your question, Steve.
Yeah, I think it does. I see Richard has a question. I'm not sure. I may have missed some. There's quite a bit going on in the chat, and Rob has been listing some great resources there. So please take a look, everybody. Richard.
Senator, I wonder about the Cash for Clunkers program. If you're thinking about that, taking low gas mileage vehicles off the road, not through trade-in, but actually to take them off the road and provide incentives for that.
Yes, and Becca might be able to talk about it, because my understanding it might be something that they start in the House, but we're not calling it Cash for Clunkers, but the Replace My Ride, which is based on a California program called Replace My Ride. And so, but it's basically the similar thing. But the trick will be finding the funds to provide that incentive. And what I like about it is it not only offers people a high mileage car or an electric car, but it also makes the suggestion that maybe they don't need a car. We'll give you free bus passes, or we'll give you an incentive to get on an electric bike or something like that.
Yeah, Senator Perchlik is correct. Mileage Smart and Replace Your Ride are two other large components of the bill. And I'm not as well versed in them as Representative Burke from Brattleboro, who is really spearheading that on our committee side. We had set aside monies in the previous bill from the previous biennium on Replace Your Ride and Mileage Smart, but we've seen that there are both some potential changes that should be made to the delivery of that program and a need for more funding to keep it going. So it's a good point.
All right, great. I see that Howie Michelson has a question. Howie.
The question basically is around Amtrak, and if anybody has looked at costing of Amtrak, if there's any way to deal with that. The last time I checked it, it was basically unaffordable, especially for family travel. But it's really a luxury travel as opposed to an economical one, as the last I looked, anyway.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. It's a good point you're making, Howie, around how do we get train travel to be more affordable. And I would also say going the places that people want to go, to what Senator Perchlik pointed out with going to Montreal. There's a lot of Vermonters who, when I think about rail travel, I think about a completely different way than we're doing it right now. It's great to have a train track that runs through White River Junction that goes up to Essex Junction, but I can't take that train to commute every day for a job. So if there was a way to both, I've affordably traveled using Amtrak versus, plane trips or driving. We've costed it out and it's been more effective to travel via train as we last could do that pre-COVID-19. But I also think the ability to have like the bud cars and commuting, that's a conversation we need to have in this state. And the Vermonter line in particular, we have I believe we had subsidized ticket prices if you're staying in state, but I don't know if I don't have a ton of information on that off the top of my head, but Andy's nodding, so maybe.
Well, we do subsidize it to something like $9 or $10 million a year.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I totally agree. I think I even saw Blittersdorf hiding on one of these screens here. So definitely the bud cars are how we could make it so, I used to have to go down to Brattleboro for meetings, and I could get down, if the meeting was just right, I could take the train, but somebody from Brattleboro can't go to Montpelier the way that the schedule is. It's just not meant to be a commuter rail. It's long distance. So to answer your question, Howie, we haven't talked about trying to make it more affordable. But there's been talk about how do we get other trains, so you could just like people from Northfield could get to Montpelier, or people from White River Junction could get to Montpelier. That's been more of the discussion lately.
So I want to add in something around financials on budgetary issues. I heard earlier today that the budget projections is that the transportation revenues are actually doing much better than they originally were predicting in September or in August. But you're still going to be what they say, probably 10 million or 11 million shortfall. But compared to what the thought process was, you're going to be in a really dire situation. So it sounds like that's positive. But then I also heard that there's possibly $56 million coming in from the federal government just from that last federal stimulus bill. So I just want to know your reaction to something like that. Like, will that make things much easier instead of being a cutthroat business where you're going to have to cut everything? So I just want to see what your reaction is towards that, Becca or Andy.
Yeah, I'm happy. I don't know if you had the presentation that we did, Senator Perchlik, on the budget, but we got a really great walkthrough today. So I feel like I printed out the budget information because there's some big numbers on here. But Rob, you're spot on. We are doing better than we reforecasted, but not as good as we would have been doing without COVID. So it's kind of like not bad, but like not great situation. And we are also potentially going to be getting a lot of federal funding, and you're exactly right. I had it as just around 50 million coming from the federal government in that recent allocation. What will be very interesting, and if anyone's got familiarity with when the ARA funding came through Vermont, I feel very lucky that we have Representative Diane Lanfer, who is the chair of our committee this year. She has a lot of familiarization, both when she was on transportation before and experienced the ARA funding coming through, and how do you get the shovel-ready projects to actually be the projects that move us forward versus just kind of meet a to-do list of backlogged projects. And she's also got a lot of experience on appropriations, having been on there. So I think we've got a good team to really respond to the budgetary, the mix of budgetary issues we're going to be facing. And while I wish I could say, yes, this federal funding coming down will mean like we're going to get everything through and it's going to be like hunky-dory, I think we are going to face a lot of pushback from the administration as they try to plan using that federal funding for maintenance or paving or other forms of more, I would say, classic budget uses of that kind of funding. But I'd love to hear what Senator Perchlik has to say.
We did not get that briefing. We got a short. We're going to have JFO in to give us the details, but I heard about it, that it was a good briefing. So I don't have the same details. Other than that, there is that federal money that will allow us to free up some state money, and it could be, $75 million or something like that. So we will hear from the administration how they're going to want to spend that money. We're just likely going to disagree with where it should go, and there will be in the rub of where we need folks like Sierra Club members to help us to convince our colleagues that it's the right thing to do to make this investment in sustainable transportation with this opportunity of the federal money. And I didn't know if there was another part of your question, Rob. My internet blanked out for a little bit while you were asking it.
No, I was just relaying that information out there so people realize that we're not in a tight budget situation as some were going to say, because, yes, the economy took a really steep hit, but with the combination of the federal funds coming in, people still purchasing vehicles, the revenue sources are still coming in, just not as well. So we don't have to slash the budget and say we can't do any of these climate priorities or priorities to help people, because we do have the revenue. It's a question about priorities and what everybody sees and how we can help people. So for those, I shared in the chat the actual presentation that I was referring to, that probably Senator Perchlik will receive the Senate Transportation Committee soon, but the House Transportation Committee had it today.
Exactly. So, the thing that strikes me is that it's too bad that he didn't talk to us, because, when Sarah was doing all that writing and we talked about it,
Ariel,
she viewed it as an educational document, that it was something there for townspeople.
Okay, there we go. So let me go to another question, another money question from Greg Hostetler. Greg.
Hi, I didn't turn on my video so you can see me. I didn't mean for it to be specifically money focused, but I guess it is. Becca, I'm wondering if you could remind us all how Efficiency Vermont works in terms of utilities, and then tell us how it might work if it expanded its mission to transportation. I assume it would be doing some of these things that you're talking about in the bills that you and Senator Perchlik had mentioned.
Greg, I think you are you're asking the exact right question, but I, unfortunately, because I know so much about both being on the Transportation Committee and working for Efficiency Vermont, I have to I can't talk about it. So I'm it's the funniest, it's one of those fun, nice conflict of interest things. So I won't speak to that, but I would love to hear Senator Perchlik's take on it.
Well, right now there's an effort to expand Efficiency Vermont's mission or charge to include thermal energy. And so I think that's going to be a big enough lift to start thinking about how it also would be do transportation. People have mentioned it before about they want an all-in-one efficiency utility, all energy, regardless of what it's being used for, transportation, thermal, or electrical. uses. So I don't see that having any kind of serious discussion now, because there are other entities that could do this work. And there's enough thermal efficiency and continuing electrical efficiency work for Efficiency Vermont to do. There's an issue about, keeping their electric efficiency charge, which is raised by the ratepayers, connected to the ratepay. The benefits go back to ratepayers. So that's easier to do when you're talking about electrical efficiency or home thermal efficiency, and it gets a little more difficult when you're talking about thermal. But you could use other revenue sources and have Efficiency Vermont do that work. And we did that last year with schools and HVAC systems. We took some of the federal money and had Efficiency Vermont, because they're experts in energy efficiency and have relationships with the schools for doing lighting and other projects. So they took non-Efficiency Vermont money to run the program and did a great job and really helped the schools be able to reopen and have children back in the schools, because they improved the air circulation so much, and also were able to do so to save energy. So I think it's a good idea. I'm sure we'll hear more about it, but it's not going to be something that is going to likely be discussed much this year.
Well, I hope you do keep it in mind and think about it medium long term, because transportation is our biggest source of climate emissions in Vermont, and it's the second biggest single household expense in Vermont, next to housing. So you could have a win-win if you could come up with a good program.
Next on the list here is Deb Sachs. Deb, has Rob answered your question in his response there about the statewide transit authority?
Yes, thanks, Rob. Thanks for answering that. I haven't seen the list, and thanks for saying yes, it is in there. But I don't know what kind of language is in there yet. So.
And Deb, first off, thank you for all the work that you do. Great to have you on the call. And Representative McCormick was very clear that needed to be in the bill. And we're going to be ideally introducing it on Friday, so folks will start to see that language really out there. But we're in kind of that getting co-sponsors, sending a draft to some, but not trying to get too much information out there. It's a very fun dance. So I apologize that you haven't quite gotten like the confirmation yet, but hopefully.
No, I know. It's okay. Appreciate that. Yeah, it'll be good to see it and see it discussed.
I want to add something really novel about what Rebecca just said. Around the legislation, this is actually a really fascinating idea. Is historically the way the Transportation Committee operates is they wait for the governor to give a budget. And once he gives the budget, he hands what's known as the big book that has all these transportation projects on it. And basically the governor and the Agency of Transportation tell the legislature what they want to do. What this Transportation Committee is doing now is instead telling the administration, this is what we want to do. This is our priorities. We want to invest in our economy. We want to invest in and make our priorities consistent with our climate values. We want to do all this. So they're actually getting ahead of the ball instead of waiting for the governor to do something. So I think this is a really fascinating leadership role that Becca and her colleagues are doing.
All right. Well, next on our list here, I'm working my way down the chat. I see we're about people are being very patient. These questions came in 15 minutes ago. So Anne D'Olivo, I'm sorry, I'm not getting your name right, but you have a question. Anne.
Hi, D'Olivo. You're almost right. So actually the first question, Richard Butts very kindly answered to me privately. I assume that service centers are used by other EV manufacturers like Toyota and the Toyota Prius, that kind of thing. So he said yes, that those are available to most of the big companies like Toyota and Ford, but Tesla is the issue here. And I also asked a question further down about hydrogen. So maybe I can can I ask that question, even though I'm kind of at the bottom of the list right now?
We'll go right ahead. Yeah, you
Okay.
pass on the
Right.
first question. So
Okay, so I wondered about hydrogen fueled transportation and what the status is, and why has not hydrogen fuel not been used more often?
There isn't anything really happening in Vermont. There are some people talking about it. There's some kind of entrepreneurs that I've talked to a couple times that want to try to do some truck traffic with hydrogen. Basically, they would just want to use natural gas to make hydrogen, or thinking about Hydro-Quebec or some other large electric producer. So, hydrogen isn't just free, so you got to make it somehow, and hopefully we'll get to a point where we're starting to build wind farms and other ways that we can electrify all of our other needs, and we might get to the point where we can make our own hydrogen. If there is some local hydrogen being made, there's maybe some opportunities for like a national system for hydrogen trucks, I think, from what I've read, but I don't see it being a solution for Vermont's transportation solution anytime soon, from at least what I've seen. And there are some concerns about, even though people like to talk about hydrogen when it's combusted, in a fuel cell, it's great because it just creates electricity. So I don't have any problem with that. But if you're combusting it, you do release water, of course, but there are also some other nitrogen oxide and other pollutants that you have to think about when you combust things like hydrogen.
okay, we go to Nick. Nick, you've also been very patient.
I'm not sure if this is within the purview of your committee, but I was wondering if your committee or the legislature more generally is giving any consideration to land use and housing policies that would assist in meeting your goals of reducing vehicle miles, automobiles, and getting people to use more public transportation. It's much more difficult to effectively have people use public transportation when they live sprawled all over the landscape like we tend to do in Vermont. In Vermont, most of our cities and towns of any size outside of Chittenden County have lost population over the last 40 years. And in addition, in some of our cities, there's a shortage of housing, and especially affordable housing. And all of these issues, I think, make it difficult for people to drive cars fewer miles and take public transit. So I'm just wondering if any consideration is being given to addressing these issues.
Go first, Mecca. Yeah, not so much in the transportation committees, at least not yet. I think that's part of what the goal is to, as Rob was saying, how things used to be done, how we want to see them change to where we're talking about that in the transportation committees. Maybe somewhat with as we get into planning and how, do you build new roads or do you convince people they got to live in different places? But it is talked about as far as Act 250 and how we do development, and how in the natural resources committees that deal more with the planning and land use and how do we stop sprawl. But it also does pertain to if we're going to have like passenger rail or microtransit, you need a density of people that are using it, and so you need to have the land use planning that goes along with encouraging that compact development.
Yeah, Nick, you asked a really good question, and it reminds me of what Greg had said earlier, was if you can do housing and transportation, like you've got it. Because those two problems are just so intertwined with, I think, anyone's ability to really get out of poverty in Vermont in one way, and then also to have a quality of life, even above and beyond just getting out of poverty. So we have a bit about that in the bill that I've been referring to. mainly around enforcing our current policies, or really not allowing the instances where you cannot do the best thing, where you can say, hey, you know, it's too expensive for us to fully implement complete streets, for example, or hey, complete streets, which is a way of designing our roads, you know, we don't want to do that because of this caveat. It's trying to lessen those caveats so that people really do have to think about how people are getting around both bike and ped. And then a bit to what Senator Perchlik said, I think many of us will have experienced the fear and concern from our rural friends that climate change activism and climate change work means hurting rural Vermont. And that argument is completely not factual. If we are to address the transportation needs of rural Vermont, we will address our climate change problems. If we can have a public transit system that serves rural parts of our state, we will have done it. That'll really be the dream come together. So to what Senator Perchlik said, rural Uber, maybe I don't know how to quite phrase that, but Ruber, as people have been calling it in our committee, I know it's, Kurt McCormick loves to call it Ruber. Anyway, there's some interesting things that can be done with not fixed route public transportation that we're seeing success in with like Medicaid transit. That kind of thing is really important. So I hope that we can continue to think creatively and out of the box. And the microtransit pilot that Senator Perchlik mentioned is really a great example of that. And I hope that we can continue to invest in it. And then again, Act 250, that's going to be a big conversation. How do we address sprawl and actually require people to meet the demands of complete streets and other policies that we've put in place, but have a lot of ability for people to like caveat themselves out of having to do. It's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Let's see, we have a question about electrifying the bud cars. Deb or David?
Hi there. Just wanted to let you all know that we have an innovative grant proposal in for VW money. There was 3.2 million set aside on a grant program to lower NOx because of the diesel settlement. And the 3.2 is in a category for railroads. What they did is they wanted solicitations for electrifying railroad switching engines. Well, in Vermont, you don't switch a lot of freight cars with switching engines. And it turns out that GE is coming out with an electric battery powered version that's 6.2 million. We put in a proposal and it's still not scored yet and figured out. Hopefully that's coming in the next few weeks. But contrary to what a lot of people do when they put in grant proposals, they don't talk about it until it's issued. Well, we're talking about this because it's so innovative that I designed a Tesla Model X drive system, their electric drive system that goes in the Model X Tesla. That rear engine unit is a 640 horsepower electric drive. That's why that is one of the fastest production cars made in the world. It will pull 1.1 Gs. It'll go 0 to 60 in 2.4 seconds. It'll go 165 miles an hour. Well, this drive system, we can take right out of a Tesla rear end and put into our bud cars and replace a 5,500 pound diesel engine and drivetrain, and it will power the bud car on batteries. You just put Tesla battery packs in, and it will power it for 30 to 40 miles, and it will go 40 miles an hour. So we can electrify a bud car and get away from the diesel. And it's a way to electrify trains, and the Europeans are doing it without high overhead catenary electric systems, and we can get off of diesels. So it's only a $200,000. That's the government share. We're putting in 30% cost share, and we want to do this. So I'm just getting the word out that I'm afraid that, frankly, our state government will not consider an innovative approach in something that's pretty darn cheap to do to prove some things. I call it the Vermont way. We do things this way, and we don't have to wait for $1 million solutions everywhere. So I'm just throwing that out there. Be aware. There's an article that's going to come out in Vermont Business Magazine probably next week detailing this whole thing. So people are starting to talk about it. I just want everybody to be aware that this is coming. So hopefully we win the grant, but if we don't, it will show where our government is putting their heads. May not be in the right place. So I hope they do this.
Senator Perchlik, Representative White, any
Yeah.
comments on that, or?
I'm glad to hear you did that, Dave. That's great, because I know they had set that money aside. We tried to get them to put more money towards electric vehicle incentives. They said, no, we gotta put it towards these diesel change outs. So either change them to electric or just change it to cleaner diesel. So I'm glad they got a proposal to.
We're losing you.
So while we're actually losing
Broadband
it,
going.
yeah, I was just going to say, Steve, that's something else that I know the House Energy and Technology Committee is going to be looking a lot into is rural broadband, so people can actually effectively work from home without these challenges with their connectivity all the time, and especially some places that can't. Like, there's no reason why people need to be driving into the office or driving into a lot of work. I haven't worked in an office now since March, so it's something we got to consider.
Senator Perchlik, you got us talking about broadband as you disappeared.
Yes. Yeah, I'm even here in Montpelier, and I still have probably get kicked off.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but now I'm psyched about the Tesla Bud car. I want to see the Bud cars go 165 now.
We have a question from Henry.
So actually, I have two questions up. The first one I think was sort of answered and by Bob Farnham, which was whether there's consideration of adding an efficiency tax to fossil fuels, just like the electric company did. And he routed me to on the chat. There's a route to a conference about that, or more information on that, which I didn't go to. And the second one is there focus on moving towards negamiles, kind of like negawatts, trying to actually reduce our driving, either home energy, home business, or working remotely, or all kinds of other things. I mean, I hear you talking about the Uber, the self-driving cars to go off and pull people out of the hills, which sounds like a great solution too. But until that arrives, anyway. So the question is there a focus on that? Can we effectively reduce the amount of miles? I mean, COVID's done it to some degree for us, but it certainly did during the early part of the summer.
Henry, I think you've framed up the conversation that we're having in committee really well. You've definitely got your finger on the pulse of the conversation with telecommuting. And it's interesting because I was working pretty in the weeds on the transportation demand management requirements last biennium, trying to require that employers with 50 or more employees develop a transportation demand management plan, which would include making it accessible to their employees to maybe work from home 2 days out of the week. And you would not have guessed just the amount of, that's impossible, it could never be done, we are an office culture, and if you get rid of that, you'll kill our business, you'll kill Vermont business. And hindsight 2020, I mean, I don't want to make light of the fact that we've had to make such a massive transition, But I do think that there's an opportunity to look at the lessons we learned from COVID-19 and that we're still learning, and really put in place best practices. And we have like CATMA, there are best practices that were developed not because of COVID-19, but just to help Vermonters and large employers get resources for telecommuting and remote working, that now just seem obvious, like we should have been working on this for decades. So I'm hoping we can get that. But to the point made by Senator Perchlik's internet, it's not accessible to every Vermonter, and not every job will work with this remote environment. So it's also providing opportunities for carpooling and public transit when needed, to help us actually reduce that. So and I'll just end by saying on the transportation demand management thing, because you got me on my soapbox, but we talk about it as a disadvantage to regulate or require these plans. But what we're doing when we think about reducing those one trip, one person vehicle rides is we have less traffic and congestion. I know some of us don't really experience that, but you know what I'm saying? There's the one day a week when it would happen. We get fewer, we have less maintenance on our roads. There's less weighted impacts on our roads. We don't have to build new infrastructure to meet demands. We don't have to have these sprawling parking lots that house hundreds of cars when we're only filling it up for a part of the time. So there's a lot of benefits, and the cost, I think, actually is saved when we think about these things. So good points.
Yeah. And that's my short answer is just yes, Henry, that are talking about those things, and we measure vehicle miles traveled, and it has actually gone down before COVID, so some of the things we were doing, I think were starting to work, but it gets into that land use question that was asked earlier as well. How do you really change people's habits to not want everybody to be in their own car? Even if it's an electric car, it's still a lot of cars driving around.
Yeah, I think employers might be pulled on board by the idea that they could use shared desk space and actually reduce their plant as well.
All right, I see, Richard, I see you made a comment. I don't know if that's a question or if I'll go on to the next one.
I just wondered, in the discussion on the using the Tesla system in the Bud cars, the speaker was talking about we. I just wondered who we is.
David?
He's just a shadowy figure there on the couch.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know him.
Okay. Did you turn me down?
Yeah.
Yeah, we is All Earth Rail. I'm the owner of All Earth Rail and the 12 Bud cars we have. And I put together a team of folks that are the engineers, the electronics guys, the mechanical guys, to put it all together. I'm a mechanical engineer designing products for 40 years. So I've done this many times, designing stuff. And so I figured out how this thing can fit. No one had ever figured out, could this work? And so it's baffling to some people. Said, how are you going to do that? I said, no. We got this figured out. And it only took a few pages of notepads to figure out the engineering on it. So it's really exciting idea. Not that Elon Musk supports this, because I have to do aftermarket parts because he won't support it directly because he's taking care of his normal Tesla business. But at some point, maybe he'll show up in Vermont once we get it working.
Sounds terrific. Thank you.
Okay, so I go to John.
Okay, I just want to, we can tinker around the edges here, but Vermont's the smallest place of the world. And there's not much we can really do to cut into all this. We need federal subsidies, federal aid to really put a big improvement in all these greenhouse gas emissions and so on and so forth. For example, obviously, if we're going to transfer transport onto electrical sources, we need to really build up our electrical grid. We need to integrated, so on and so forth. And it's kind of hard to take transport here and then land use there. All these things come together and they have to be integrated somehow. But the bottom line is that the federal government can run deficits and subsidize the states. The states have a balanced budget requirement. And especially now that the federal government currently is not providing even the bailout needs of the states to deal with our current fiscal shortfalls. And I just on the news today, there was some estimate that the total shortfall is $500 billion for the 50 states. So that's one point I wanted to make. The other thing, I'm really skeptical about lithium-ion batteries and electrifying cars. Cars are, it takes a lot of energy and natural resources to produce cars. There are 200 million or more cars on the roads and light trucks in the United States right now. There's 1 billion in the world. The industry is projecting 2 billion cars. Where are all the natural resources going to come to build all those cars, and what will it take out of the earth, so on and so forth. And I don't think lithium-ion batteries have a great future. I tend to, not right now, but a decade from now, I tend to think hydrogen fuel cells produced by renewable energy will be far better for the planet. And this is going to take a lot of federal money, federal research, and basically we're going to require, we don't have that now. We're changing administrations and we might get some more money for these kind of things with the new administration. I've got my fingers crossed. I'm not really hopeful, but we have to think about things like, if we're going to electrify transport, we need to greatly increase our electrical production, which is a problem in itself, and Steve has his opinions on this. And we also need to make the grid much more resilient so it won't go out. If it goes out and our homes are and lighting is out, that's one thing. But if our transport is out, that's another thing. So there's going to be, it's going to take a national and international effort. So I just, I appreciate the efforts that are being made. I really like the Bud cars. I recall years ago, there was a proposal for a rail between Rutland and Burlington that never got anywhere, We need a lot more rail. We need urban mass transit systems to replace automobiles. We can do that in Chittenden County easily. We can't do that in the rest of Vermont. But we need to think of all the kinds of moving parts that we have to put together, and it's not easy. And I would suggest that we don't rush into charging stations based on lithium-ion batteries. We take it a bit slower. There's a lot of things we can do. One of the things in Vermont is that one of the reasons our emissions are rising is because SUVs and pickup trucks are the largest part of sales. And that's all wrong. People are not, we don't have incentives to get people to move away from, gas guzzling and expensive cars and trucks to something that will be more efficient. So we have to think about how to change those incentives. But a lot of the rise in emissions from transport has been precisely because people are buying, quote, the wrong kinds of vehicles. So I'll just leave it there. It's a lot of mixed up stuff. But
yeah, if only we had a chair of Senate Appropriations that cared about climate, right?
I don't know who the chair is right now.
Well, wait a couple of weeks.
Okay.
Any response? Senator?
Well, yeah, well, definitely the sales. I was looking at the stats recently that residential or, passenger vehicles, regular sedans, used to be something like 65% in Vermont. And over the last 30 years, it's gone all the way down to like 25%. So 75% of the vehicles are trucks or SUVs in Vermont today. So, but I disagree that we should be waiting around because people are going to buy those cars. I agree that it would be better not to have the cars, that we need to try to switch. But Vermont, as said, is too small to affect the market. So the market's going to lithium ion and electric vehicles, then we want to get as much fossil fuel vehicles off the road as possible. And so I think, in the long term, if something else comes along, if hydrogen fuel cells happen, then that's fine. But I don't want to wait around burning gas in all our cars while we try to figure out what the perfect solution is. It's similar to the arguments we've had about wind farms that you shouldn't build a wind farm on ridgeline because of some of the impacts, because there'll be something better along later, or we shouldn't be using so much electricity in the first place. But my view is, well, if we're going to use electricity, let's use it with renewables, including wind farms, and then figure out the other problems later.
I'm going to go to, we're getting close to the end, so I'm going to go to Peter, who's had a question there for a bit.
Hi, thank you guys so much for coming on. I was wondering what you guys are thinking in terms of weatherproofing roads, especially as extreme weather events are increasing and the infrastructure is taking the brunt of that.
No, we'll have to get Blittersdorf's engineering team on that. I know that the VTrans does have an R&D section, and so they are looking at different things. I haven't heard of them about weatherproofing. They've talked about other different aggregates and ways to prolong the pavement, but I haven't heard about weatherproofing.
Yeah, you bring up a really good concept, Peter, because I do think when we talk about our current infrastructure, we're not taking into account at the level we need to be the impacts of climate change, because the experiences we're having right now are just the beginning of some extreme weather events that we're going to be consistently facing that will increase the cost on maintenance, that will increase the cost on just keeping our infrastructure at the level it's at now, rather than just improving it, which I think all of us would like to see. When I think about weatherproofing, when I think about resiliency, the culverts are like the thing that I hear. It's all about making sure that we can get stormwater runoff, that we're having a focus on culvert sizes that are 100-year flood or 100-year weather event every single time we build a culvert, rather than building it if we think it's a likelihood. And we've got a really good asset management plan that that AOT, the Agency of Transportation, maintains. And what's been great to see is how, we got the report today, just kind of looking at 2020, but the level of roads that went from the gradation of good to fair to poor to unsafe, we're really shrinking the poor and the fair and growing the good. So while I haven't heard of anything extremely exciting on innovative weatherizing or weatherproofing of our roads, I do think that we've got an asset management plan that AOT has been implementing that responds and thinks about resiliency and climate change. Maybe not to the full extent we need to, but they're taking it into account far better than other states. Going to the National Conference of State Legislators, they're talking about Vermont. And it's well, we're trying to do better. So if we're ahead of the curve, that's not a good sign.
Hey, I wanted to throw in something since Andy called me out. As far as roads and what we're doing, because we're an auto-centric system. And one of the things, I grew up in Vermont, I grew up driving in snow. We are spending over $1 billion a year because we salt our highways. This is absolutely absurd. We have to halt the salt. We're destroying our lakes, we're destroying our seams with salt levels. And the other thing we're doing is allowing people to drive 75 miles an hour in the middle of winter. And when you drive fast, you use a lot of gas. The difference between driving 55 and 65 is 15% less energy. And, I talked to Governor Scott about this. He said, well, people want clear roads. I said, tough beans. Every one of you have seen when you go down the highway in a snowstorm, who's in the ditch? It's the SUVs that think they can drive 80 miles an hour. We have to stop this. We're destroying our infrastructure, our bridges, our cars, and we could get rid of things like inspection because we're rusting out all our brakes every year. And if you ever noticed an orange state truck that spreads brine, it's rusted out and it's like it was only 3 years old. It's really stupid. So this is something we could do for affordability of Vermont. Just stop salting.
Gosh, yeah, you have such a good point there, David. And it's funny because we talked about in committee, Representative McCormick introduced a bill last biennium to lower the speed limit to 55 throughout the state. And when you look at the car, I mean, it's just, if you wanted to really snap your fingers and make a real impact, it would be doing that. But the political capital and the will to do it, I have not heard. I mean, maybe maybe it's the Sierra Club's next big push, but I just really haven't heard from a constituent who's like, yes, lower it to 55.
Yeah, the difference between going from Burlington to Montpelier at 55 versus 65 is what, 7 minutes? Are you kidding? Why aren't we doing
I need to get there now.
And you know, it lowers your gas mileage when you have 3 huge flags flying out the back of your 4-door pickup truck.
Yeah.
Just wanted to point that out.
Those are good points.
I think we've got a final comment. Andy, did you have a question, comment there?
I thought those were good points, but I saw somebody had a text about TCI, and I wanted to say that is, I think, is an important thing. We need to keep pushing on it. I think if we can make that happen, that would have really significant impacts. Unfortunately, the other large states didn't join in. The governor, I think, because other states didn't join in, he felt like got cold feet on it. But he's not pulling all the way out of it and just saying no way like Governor Sununu in New Hampshire did. So I'm hopeful that we can keep talking about the positive aspects of that. And if New York and other states join, I think then we could convince the governor to have Vermont or the other, we can try to do it over his objection, but hopefully we can join up in a couple of years, especially if New York joins.
So I want to add on something about the Transportation Climate Initiative. The Sierra Club was an early supporter of the whole regional approach towards this. But over the summer, we were contacted by the Climate Justice Alliance with concerns about the equity concerns, about equity issues. And what their concerns were, a lot of market-based systems in the past have unfairly impacted BIPOC communities. So they requested us to remove our support of it. So the Sierra Club in the region has removed our support of the Transportation Climate Initiative because we feel like there was not enough equity concerns addressed. However, here in Vermont, if we are to proceed with it, we're going to be working to make sure that equity concerns are addressed. So we hopefully, through the Climate Council that is now reviewing after a result of the Climate Global Warming Solutions Act, we'll dive into these equity questions so that we can make sure that those most impacted by these issues are benefiting and we're not making it more difficult on them. So we're not fully opposing it, but we want to see more equity addressed on that. So, but I want everybody to be aware where the Sierra Club's position on that, and we still see it as a possibility of reducing climate emissions throughout the region, and it is a big chunk of emissions in the region.
Deb, is your hand raised from before? Yeah, okay. Well, I think that, it's a little after 8, and I think that brings us to the end of our conversation tonight. Thank you so much to our 2 guests, to Senator Perchlik and Representative White. It's a great conversation tonight. Rob has been recording this, and you probably all know that if you want to save the chat, all that stuff that's in the chat, you can go to the bottom of the chat box there, and those 3 little dots on the right will give the option to save the chat for yourself. I think Rob gets it saved when he gets the recording, so he'll have all these great resources too if you want to get hold of that. But again, thanks so much, everybody. It's a great turnout tonight, great discussion. Thanks for all the terrific questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sierra.